They laughed when he tripped over his own feet. They rolled their eyes when he chased impossible dreams. To them, he was the clumsy boy with big talk and no future, the one who didn't dress like the others, didn't speak like the others, and certainly didn't belong among their success stories. But the same neighbors who once mocked his every move were the ones who stood in stunned silence when he risked everything to save them. Because when the day came that truly mattered, it wasn't strength or wealth that made a hero. It was the heart they never bothered to see. He was the kind of boy who stood out without meaning to. Not because he was loud or flashy, but because he moved through life a little differently. His clothes were always a bit too big, his shoes often patched or mismatched, and his hair never quite sat the way others expected. He had a mind that wandered past walls, past rules, past what everyone else called normal. He asked strange questions in class, questions that made teachers uncomfortable or impatient. He tinkered with broken toys, tried to build windmills out of plastic bottles, drew diagrams on scraps of cardboard and believed they could change something real. Most people didn't understand him, and because they didn't understand him, they decided he wasn't worth understanding. The other kids laughed when he shared his ideas. They laughed when his projects failed. They laughed when he mispronounced words, or when he stayed behind after school to ask questions no one cared to answer. But it wasn't just the kids. Adults chuckled too, behind polite smiles. They labeled him with words that sounded harmless but carried weight. Different, slow, troubled. His neighbors treated him like the background noise of the street. Always there, never worth paying attention to. When he walked by, they lowered their voices. When he tried to join in, they found ways to leave him out. It wasn't cruelty with sharp edges. It was the dull ache of indifference, of being dismissed before you even had a chance to prove yourself. And yet, through all of it, he kept going. He kept drawing blueprints on napkins, kept building little machines out of spare wires, kept showing up at community cleanups even when no one invited him. He talked about becoming an inventor or a rescuer, or someone who could fix things that other people gave up on. But those dreams only made people laugh harder. They saw a boy who didn't belong in their version of the world. A boy who would never rise above the quiet corner they'd placed him in. They mistook his silence for weakness, his imagination for foolishness. They pointed at him not because they saw danger, but because they saw nothing at all. And in that nothingness, they created their own definition of who he was supposed to be. He noticed it all. The whispers, the glances, the way doors didn't open for him like they did for others. But he didn't let it harden him. He carried it, quietly, the way some people carry invisible weights. And even though no one believed it yet, he was already growing into the kind of person who would one day be remembered not for how he was laughed at, but for how he answered when it mattered most. He learned early on that arguing against judgment rarely changed it. So instead of speaking back, he turned inward. While others spent time mocking or dismissing him, he spent time learning. Not in classrooms where he was often overlooked, but in libraries, online forums, and repair shops where people were too busy to judge. He read instruction manuals no one else bothered to open. He watched videos about fixing appliances, wiring homes, treating wounds, and preparing for emergencies. What started as curiosity became quiet expertise. He never bragged. He never corrected others. He just kept practicing. He fixed broken radios for neighbors without charging them. He helped older residents carry groceries or patch leaky pipes when no one else was around. He stayed after local events to clean up, not for attention, but because he couldn't stand seeing things left undone. People barely noticed, and if they did, they saw it as odd rather than admirable. But he didn't stop. He wasn't looking for applause. He was building something inside himself, something stronger than their words, steadier than their laughter. He understood that trust wasn't something handed to people like him. It had to be earned slowly, quietly, over time. So he worked. He learned CPR from an old PDF file. He studied basic mechanical systems from broken lawnmowers in someone else's trash. He practiced tying knots, understanding pressure systems, memorizing numbers to call in an emergency. There was no certificate, no mentor, no structured path, just persistence, just purpose. While the world told him he'd never be useful, he was preparing to become exactly that. Every task he took on, every skill he taught himself, was done, without asking permission, because he knew no one would grant it anyway. And through it all, he remained kind, not out of naivety, but out of choice. He never let bitterness take root, never mocked those who had once mocked him. His resilience wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind built brick by brick in silence, and as the years passed, he grew into someone who understood how things worked. Machines, systems, even people. He could walk into a room and notice what was broken, what was missing, what was unsafe. He developed instincts not from training, but from observation and repetition. And though the world around him continued to underestimate his value, he had already become something rare. He had become dependable in a world that often wasn't. And one day, when that world turned chaotic and uncertain, he would be ready, not to prove anyone wrong, but to finally show them what they had ignored for far too long. It had been the kind of day no one expects to remember. Quiet, ordinary, wrapped in the usual rhythm of small-town life. Children rode bikes through the streets, adults exchanged casual greetings from across fences, and windows were open to let in the breeze. But in a single, jarring instant, everything changed. A loud, violent blast shattered the calm, followed by a thick column of smoke that rose above the rooftops like a warning to the entire neighborhood. Panic set in fast. People screamed, stumbled out of houses, called names of loved ones as they searched for them through smoke and confusion. The source was a gas explosion. An aging pipe in one of the older homes had finally given way, and flames now licked up the walls as the fire spread from room to room. While most people ran in the opposite direction, looking for safety or waiting for professionals to arrive, he did the opposite. Without hesitating, he moved toward the noise, toward the danger, toward the place everyone else feared. There was no protective gear, no badge to back him, no official role. What he had was instinct, sharpened by years of self-taught knowledge, and hands-on effort that no one had taken seriously. Until now. He knew how to navigate smoke. He knew where gas lines were most likely located. He understood how to check if a structure was safe to enter and when it wasn't. It wasn't guesswork. It was readiness born from all those quiet years spent learning, observing, and preparing without applause. In the chaos, he spotted two children trapped on a porch that was starting to collapse. Without flinching, he reached them, lifted them, and carried them to safety. He found an elderly woman inside, coughing violently in her smoke-filled kitchen, too disoriented to move. He wrapped a wet cloth around her mouth and led her step through the back door. Each move he made was calculated, calm, and focused. Not because he wasn't scared, but because he knew fear couldn't lead in moments like this. As others watched helplessly, unsure what to do, he shut off the main gas valve, slowing the spread of fire before it reached the adjacent homes. By the time emergency responders arrived, much of the immediate danger had been handled. They were shocked by what they found, not because they didn't expect bravery, but because they didn't expect it from him. The boy they once ignored had stepped into the chaos like someone born for it. No one had asked him to save anyone. No one had believed he could. And yet, there he was, covered in ash, breathing heavy but standing, having done what others could not. In that moment, the neighborhood's memory of who he was began to shift, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The laughter that had once followed him down sidewalks was gone, replaced by a silence that said more than words ever could. The same people who had rolled their eyes at his ideas, who had whispered jokes about his odd behavior and strange inventions, now looked at him with something far more complicated than awe. It was respect, yes, but it was also regret. Regret for not having seen him clearly. Regret for the assumptions they made so easily. And, most of all, regret for how much time they'd spent dismissing someone who had just saved them. Some offered apologies in words, stammered phrases filled with discomfort and sincerity. Others spoke without speaking, handing him water bottles, sweeping debris beside him, making space in ways they never had before. Their eyes dropped when he passed, not from judgment but from the weight of what they now knew. He had been everything they had failed to recognize, capable, prepared, and brave, and they had missed it entirely. But he didn't seek their apologies. He didn't wait for them to catch up. He simply did what he always had, kept moving forward without bitterness, without fanfare. He helped clear the wreckage, checked in on those affected, and quietly offered tools, repairs, and support. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted people to be okay. For years, he had been the object of mockery, the one they thought would never do anything useful. But when the moment came that demanded action, he was the one who didn't freeze. He was the one who didn't wait. And now, the neighbors who once laughed at him found themselves unsure of what to say in his presence. Not because he asked them to feel small, but because they realized on their own how wrong they had been. He hadn't changed overnight. He had always been this person. They were the ones who had taken too long to see it. The realization humbled them. It made them rethink the way they looked at difference, at quiet people, at those who don't fit into their narrow definitions of success. The boy they had once dismissed had become the measure of strength in their community, not because he shouted, but because he showed up. And in that showing up, he didn't demand credit. He didn't correct them. He didn't remind them of their laughter or their words. His actions had already said everything. Now, the silence they gave him wasn't cold or cruel. It was reverent. It was the sound of a neighborhood learning something uncomfortable, something necessary. They hadn't just misjudged a boy. They had missed out on knowing someone extraordinary. And, for the first time, they knew it. The story didn't stay within the fences of the neighborhood for long. Word spread, first among nearby towns, then across regional news. Journalists came looking for quotes, wanting to capture a narrative of bravery that shocked them not because of what happened, but because of who it came from. Headlines called him a hero, a symbol of quiet courage, a reminder that strength can live in places people overlook. But through all of it, he remained unchanged. He still woke up early, still wore the same worn-out sneakers, still fixed squeaky doors and broken radios for free. He didn't bask in the praise, didn't seek recognition. When people asked him how he did it, his answers were simple, honest, and brief. He didn't believe he had done anything special. He had simply done what he could when it was needed most. That was enough for him. But for the community around him, it was more than enough. It reshaped how they looked at him, and how they looked at themselves. The boy they had once laughed at now walked through those same streets with quiet dignity, and the laughter had turned to nods of respect, warm greetings, and held-back apologies wrapped inside kind gestures. Children who once mocked him now followed him with admiration, asking questions not out of mockery, but out of genuine interest. Parents who once warned their kids to stay away now used his name as an example of courage, of resilience, of how wrong first impressions can be. And yet, even with all this change, he didn't elevate himself. He still stood at the back of community events, still offered help before being asked, still chose humility over attention. The town had found in him something they hadn't known, they were missing. A real-life reminder that greatness isn't loud, it isn't shiny, and it doesn't need a platform. Sometimes it's built in quiet rooms, shaped by hard days, and revealed only when the world needs it most. And in this boy they once ignored, they had found that truth, not because he forced them to see it, but because he lived it, day by day. act by act, with steady hands, clear eyes, and a heart that never gave up on doing what was right, even when no one was watching. The boy they had dismissed had become the man they now looked up to, not through words or applause, but through proof. And in that proof, they didn't just find a hero. They found a better version of themselves reflected back.